Chinese Religion, Part 7, the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty was founded by Liu Bang. He was actually a leader of rebels against the Qin Dynasty. He raised an army and he was able to overthrow the remnants of the Qin and establish a new dynasty called the Han. And he assumed the name Emperor Gao Tzu once he took the throne. It's customary in ancient China to have a different name that you gain when you become a ruler. The Qin dynasty had succeeded in unifying all of China and creating a highly centralized, sort of bureaucratic imperial system of government in which a lot of the authority was held by ministers appointed by the emperor and not just by hereditary nobles. However, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, Qin Shi Huang, his rule was pretty harsh and authoritarian, and this led to a lot of resentment. Death penalty and forced enslavement were used as common punishments. There were people forced to serve in his armies, forced to work in his projects like building a giant tomb for him. Plus, even though he was served by capable administrators like Li Si, there was a lot of scheming and backbiting in his administration, and that really led to some disorder. After his death, his son Qin Shi became the second Qin emperor, but his reign did not last for very long. It faced continued scheming by the chief ministers, but also rebellions. So Liu Bang was a part of that general chaotic situation. When he became emperor, he basically tried to rule in a less authoritarian style than the Qin emperors had. So he freed some of the slaves, he softened up some of the punishments on the laws, so made less use of the death penalty and forced enslavement. I think he also did not get rid of the labor tax, but he decreased the amount of labor that people would owe to the government and just decreased taxes generally. So these relatively more moderate policies were probably part of the reason why the Han Dynasty lasted for as long as it did. It was very stable and prosperous. It lasted for around 400 years. The brief period of non-Han rule between the years 9 and 25 CE. So that brief intermediary period splits up the dynasty into the Western or former Han and the Eastern or latter Han. But during this time, China became increasingly united. The territory expanded to include part of Central Asia along the Silk Road, and also expanded to the south. During the Han Dynasty, the Yin-Yang Jia, or the school of yin and yang theory, continued, but it didn't really continue as a separate school of thought. The teachings of the Yin-Yang school, including Yin-Yang theory and the theory of the Wu-Xing 5 elements or 5 phases, became adopted by the class of scholars in general. So it became integrated both into Confucianism, into Daoism, and to just Chinese culture generally. The Yin-Yang theory was actually expanded during the Han. So you had this elaborate system of correspondences that was developed. So the 5 elements or phases, wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, were connected to a bunch of different properties or aspects of nature, such as the directions, colors, seasons, organs of the human body, emotions, senses of human perception. They were also connected to Yin-Yang theory. So this idea of the lesser and the greater Yang, the lesser and the greater Yin, the development of Yang and Yin to different stages where you have a younger or less developed version and an older, more mature or greater version. This was originating in the theory of the Yi Jing or the Book of Changes, but it was certainly developed by the scholars of the Han Dynasty connected to the five elements, but also this more elaborate system of correspondences. So the idea is the wood element, for example, could have some kind of control over the liver, and also would be associated with the spring. So that element would be stronger during the spring, and so on. Connected to this idea of the system of correspondences was Gan Ying, which means impulse and response. So it's the idea that every event in nature is connected to others through causation. It's like a cause-effect idea. This cause-effect process does not merely correspond to a sort of scientific conception of natural law, which is a kind of blind or purposeless process, or at least can be interpreted that way. But the Gan Ying is a type of synchronicity. So events which seem to be coincidental but actually have a kind of meaning to them. So there's a kind of order or pattern or meaning to the system of cause and effect, of impulse and response. So this is also became connected to Chinese medicine, for example, in which different elements and seasons can affect the health of the organs of the body. You also can see the integration between the parts of the body and emotion. So there's a kind of connection between mind and the human body in this system. Confucianism became prominent during the Han Dynasty because of its being promoted by the Han emperors. This led to what is known as state Confucianism. So Confucianism kind of developed as a political philosophy, including some influence by the Fa Jia or legalist school that had been predominant during the Qin, but also taking ideas from Mo Tzu, such as the idea that the government should promote the material welfare of the people. And also the Confucian scholar Xunzi, who had been active during the earlier Warring States period, his idea that the government should promote moral education, both of the scholar class, but also ideally of everyone, that became a part of the ideology of Confucianism during the Han. In addition to the development of the political aspect of Confucianism, the religious aspect became more developed in terms of the doctrine. So Confucius himself had not taught directly about the nature of gods or spirits, but they created a systematic classification of gods and spirits into either heavenly or earthly gods. The heavenly gods are associated with yang energy, the earthly gods with yin energy. This was a part of Chinese religion generally, but this idea of the classification and also the hierarchy of gods and spirits, assigning particular roles to gods and spirits, that you would have ceremonies honoring them based on what you needed from them, that became a part of Confucianism at this time, in part because the Confucian scholars became responsible for leading the religious ceremonies in the court of the emperor. Also, the idea that had originated in Huang Lao, the early form of Daoism, of a trinity of heaven, earth, and humanity, was taken into Confucianism. So the sage or wise person is regarded as the perfection of humanity. And a sage can serve as a bridge or link, allowing the heavenly principle, the kind of ideal order of heaven, to manifest on earth. This is a picture of a statue of Confucius, a modern statue, in front of the Confucius temple in his hometown of Qufu in China. So you did eventually get the development of temples that were dedicated to Confucius and his followers. These are also sometimes called temples of learning or temples of culture, as well as Confucian temples. And they would sometimes have images of Confucius and the other Confucian sages, who would basically be worshipped as gods or kind of like national ancestor spirits. Dong Chongshu was a Confucian scholar from the early part of the Han Dynasty, and he was very important because he basically created a syncretic form of Confucianism, which combined the original primarily ethical and political teachings with ideas from the divination experts or diviners who served the emperors at court, with ideas from Huang Lao, Yin-Yang school, and also Mengzi and Xunzi, the prominent Confucians of the Warring States period. So even though these were originally different systems of thought, and even Mengzi and Xunzi, even though they were both Confucians, they had different ethical teachings. Like, for example, Mengzi thought that human nature was inherently good or had a tendency towards goodness. Xunzi was more pessimistic. He thought humans were inherently selfish. Xunzi was also skeptical about the existence of gods or spirits. But Dong Chongchu took ideas from all of these sources and combined them together. And this became very influential on later Confucians. Confucianism became mainly rooted in the theory of Confucius, but still highly syncretic, drawing doctrines from other sources as well. This syncretic version of Confucianism influenced Emperor Wu of Han. So because of Dong Chongchu persuading and talking to Emperor Wu, the emperor decided to make Confucianism the state religion. Now, what this meant in practice was that Confucian ritual experts would be hired to perform ceremonies at the court, and they would have a lot of influence in the government. So some examples of this, there was eventually formed under later Han emperors, the Dai Shui. This literally means the great learning. This was an academy in the capital city, Chang'an, dedicated to the study of the Confucian classics. So scholars would be hired by the emperor to study the classics, to write commentaries, to copy the texts, and to kind of preserve the teachings that had originally been created during the Zhou dynasty. And so this is really important because most or all of the classic texts that were preserved for later generations were collected, put into their official form, and commentaries on them were authored at this academy. So it became the basis for much of later Chinese culture scholarship, including religious texts. And then later on as well, this is after the reign of Emperor Wu, later emperors in the Han Dynasty created an examination system based on the 5 classics of Confucianism. So the idea is that what qualifies you for government is not just who you know, whether you're a family member of the emperor or a friend of someone in a position of power, but what you know about the Confucian classics. And whether you're a wise, educated scholar, that is the basis for your being hired by the government. So it was, at least in theory, a basis for meritocracy, or promoting people based on their actual merit or abilities. Now, in truth, in time, this somewhat degenerated into people getting hired based on their ability to demonstrate knowledge of the classics, but where that was mainly tested in terms of what they could memorize. So it didn't really reward sincerity and self-cultivation or originality of thought. But at least in principle, it was a nod towards the Confucian principle of meritocracy, which is appointing those who are actually knowledgeable and wise to positions of authority. An important principle of Confucian ethics that developed during the Han is Chong Yong, which means doctrine of the mean. Chong means mean or middle point or balance. According to this doctrine, virtue is conceived of as a balance between 2 extremes. So the idea is a sage or a wise person, a junzi, tries to balance out conflicting considerations. And if he goes too far in either direction, he gets into trouble, morally speaking. This balance is something that partially has to be known intuitively, even though it's based on your knowledge of the classics, of history, of ritual. You also have to use your inner perception and intuition. And there's a notion that someone who's a master of this has both an inner harmony that can connect to a cosmic harmony. So a very developed person morally can have an impact on the world beyond them. So that's the cosmic dimension to this. Even though Confucius didn't have this specific name or doctrine, it is based on teachings of Confucius. In the Analects, or Lun Yu, the collected sayings of Confucius, he had a notion that when you're performing a ritual or a ceremony, you should go for an ideal of hei, or harmonious ease. And this was conceived of as a balance between correctness in the form of your outer action and an inner feeling of sincerity. So if you don't pay enough attention to the form of the ceremony, that is going to reduce its significance or impact. But also, if you're not performing the ceremony with the right inner attitude, that will also ruin its significance. So you want to balance the outer form with the inner feeling. And that idea became expanded to all of Confucian ethics by the Confucian scholars of the Han. There was also a development of numbered lists of virtues and of the Confucian relationships. So there's something called the five constants, or the five constant relationships in Confucianism. Confucius had talked about the importance of all these relationships, but didn't give the ordered numbered list. The first is the relationship between parent and child. So the parent gives birth to the child, has authority over the child. The child is supposed to respect their parents and obey them. And the parent also, though, has duties. They're supposed to provide for and protect and educate their children. So that basic pattern of having one person in authority over another, the other person owing them respect or deference, but the person with the superior position still supposed to protect and guide the one with the inferior position. That's the theme of all of these five relationships. According to Confucian ethics, the older brother of a family, or the eldest brother of a collection of siblings, has authority over the younger ones. So it's as if the older brother is a substitute parent or father. In the husband-wife relationship, the husband is also supposed to have authority over the wife, according to Confucianism. Even among friends, there's a hierarchy. So whoever is older has a kind of authority or precedence over whoever is younger. And then the last relationship is that between a ruler and their minister or subject, someone who serves them. You could also say master, servant, or even like boss, employee, teacher, student, things like that. So the fifth one can cover any other social relationship where there's a hierarchy. Well, the idea of the hierarchy is that there is inequality inherent in these relationships. So this is different from Mo Tzu's ethics that you should care for everyone equally, regardless of your relationship with them. But as I mentioned, even though the person who is in the senior position has authority over the junior, it's a two-way street. So not only are they supposed to protect and guide the junior, there's even a notion in Confucianism that if the senior member is being irresponsible, unethical, especially to an extreme degree, then the junior member does have a duty to try to persuade them to correct their ways, and ultimately can speak out even though they're supposed to give them deference. And it can even have a political dimension, as we've seen in previous videos, where the subject of a ruler is supposed to have some ability to speak out against a tyrannical ruler. You could call this a relationalist ethic or a relationalist moral philosophy. Moral duties are not the same for everyone. They depend on the specific relationships you have with other people. And as I said, you can contrast this rather sharply with Mo Tzu's Ji and I, or impartial caring ethic, where at least in principle, you owe the same to everyone because of our common humanity. Note that this is not the same as moral relativism, even though the words look similar, and you might mistake the two. Relativism in morality is the view that the duties you have, or the moral value of something, or the moral rightness of an action, or what counts as a moral virtue, all of these moral truths depend on the perception or the value or the belief of an individual person or of a culture or a group of people. Confucian ethics does not seem relativist. It seems objectivist. So that means there is a fact of the matter that's true for everyone about what is virtue, what is the correct way for a child to relate to their parents, for example. But even though it's the same fact for everyone, the particular duty you have, it's not based on your perception, belief, or feeling or value, but it is based on that objective relationship you have to other people. So you're not supposed to treat everyone the same. You're supposed to treat your parents differently from your children. You're supposed to treat your parent differently from your ruler, etc. Another principle or illustration of Confucian ethics is the text called Xiao Jing, which means the classic or text of Xiao, filial piety. So filial piety or Xiao is a virtue in which you're supposed to show respect for your parents. It's literally the sort of attitude or emotion that a dutiful son is supposed to show to their parents. But according to the text of Xiao Jing, this is the basis for all of the Confucian virtues, and indeed for the whole order of society, the morality of the public, broadly construed. And that idea does go back to the beginnings of Confucianism, the idea that if you respect your parents, you're going to be likely to respect your ruler and other people in society. Whereas if you don't respect your parents, it's unlikely that you're going to respect others. So also because the parent-child relationship is the first one a person develops, it kind of sets the model for how they're going to relate to other people, psychologically speaking. So that idea, though, was developed even more in the Xiao Jing, so that Xiao really becomes kind of like the preeminent Confucian virtue. There's also an exploration of the religious dimension of Confucianism in this text. So your veneration for or respect for your ancestors connects the human world to the spirit world. So there is a kind of spiritual or religious dimension to Confucianism that is actually illustrated in ancestor veneration. So even though ancestor veneration or ancestor worship predates Confucianism, it goes back apparently to the roots of Chinese civilization, it was something that was emphasized a lot by Confucian scholars because of its connection to this Confucian virtue of Xiao. So traditionally, men are highlighted in Confucianism. Almost all of the main Confucian scholars were men. Confucius did not have any female students. He only taught men. It was typical to give men an education, but not women. Chinese society in general was highly patriarchal from ancient to modern times. However, despite this, there were some Confucian texts that were about women or directed to women, and even some by women. So one example of this is the Confucian scholar Liu Xiang, who was a man, but he wrote a book called The Biographies of Exemplary Women. And so this contains stories of women who showed Confucian virtues. There were also stories of other women who did not display virtue, they displayed the opposite. So the idea is women, according to this view, are not really supposed to be in the main positions of authority. So it would probably be regarded as going against the natural order of things to have women emperors. That happened very rarely. I think only once in the whole history of China. There were women sometimes who had the actual authority behind the scenes, but in theory only the men were supposed to rule, and the Confucians did echo that sentiment. But there was a thought also that women play a very important role on the ethics of their families and of the order of society because of the large influence they wield over the men in their life. So they have this important but indirect role in the prosperity of their family and indeed of the entire empire, if you look at the imperial family. So one important aspect of this text was stories of Meng Mu, which means the mother of Meng. Meng was Meng Tse, the important Confucian scholar of the Warring States period. And his mother was believed to have been an important moral influence on him, and she herself was a kind of paragon of Confucian virtue. So there are these little pithy sayings or proverbs, such as Meng's mother moved thrice and Meng's mother cut the weft, which illustrate Confucian virtues. Meng's mother moved thrice or 3 times is a summary of a story of Meng in his early childhood. So his father died when he was young. The family was impoverished. His mother had to work for a living to support her young son. So he was raised by a single mom, essentially. He did get an education, and he was from basically a gentry or lesser noble family. But his mother had to go to work being a weaver. Also, she had to move. The first time that she moved with her son, they moved next to a cemetery. And it was a custom traditionally in China when you buried someone to hire mourners if you could afford it. And the mourners are people who are basically like actors who would pretend to mourn the death of your family member or loved one. And this was basically a way of showing your importance and the prestige of your family by having all these extra people mourn for you. Well, little Meng observed this practice and he came home pretending to cry and mourn for the deceased. And his mother, Meng Mu, didn't like this because she regarded it as a violation of the Confucian principle of sincerity. You know, you shouldn't have this fake mourning or other fake emotions. So she moved, and this time they were closer, though, to a marketplace. And this basically allowed little Meng to, when he went outside to play during the day, he saw all of the merchants buying and selling and haggling. And he came back home imitating them, buying and selling. Well, his mom didn't like this either because there was this idea that you shouldn't mainly be concerned or only be concerned with money, that moral virtue and education was more important. So she moved for the 3rd time, and this time she was close to a school where they were studying the classics. And then Meng, when he went off to play that day, because he was very young at this point, he was observing all the scholars and the students, and when he came back home, he was imitating them, learning and studying. And his mother liked this, so she decided to stay there. And eventually he became a student at that school. So this shows you a couple things, both the Confucian idea that the environment you're in has a huge impact on your moral upbringing. So you should pay attention to the influences on children. And plus the importance of education or learning for moral development. The next proverb, Meng's mother cut the weft, which you can see illustrated in the picture on the right, is a reference to the time that little Meng came home from school and his mother asked him, well, what did you learn from school today, or how did it go? And he gave a kind of blasé answer like, oh, it was just an ordinary day, nothing special. Well, his mom was upset about this, so she cut all the fabric she had woven that day, and that was how she was supporting herself and her son. And when Meng asked her why she did this, she said, a day without learning is like a day without work. So in other words, learning is just as important. You should take it just as seriously as a job you use to support yourself. And every day of learning is something you should value and try to get value from and take seriously and work hard. So it's kind of illustrating this Confucian principle of not only the value of education, but that you should devote yourself to it and make an important effort. The weft, by the way, is a reference to the fabric when you're weaving. And so when you're cutting the weft, you're basically disrupting that crisscross pattern of the threads that are woven together in cloth. So another example of the role of women in Confucianism is the female scholar Bon Chao. So she was a rare example of a woman who not only was literate, but became a really well-regarded scholar in history and just Confucian education generally. So she was from a family of scholars, which was apparently how she got her education from her father alongside her brothers. Her brother Bon Gu was unable to complete his history of the Western Han Dynasty, which was called the Book of Han. So after his death, she completed that. She also wrote a text called the Lessons for Women, or Admonitions for Women. And she was basically given advice both for the moral education of women along Confucian principles, but also lists of virtues for women. How should they conduct themselves? So there were these four virtues or four precepts for women. And on the one hand, Bon Chao is an example of how a woman could lead an independent life because she did get married, but her husband died when she was young. And so she was able to devote herself to her studies. And from her point of view, she was actually honoring the memory of her husband by not remarrying. This was regarded as a kind of symbol of womanly virtue or female merit or purity or devotion to their husband. But practically speaking, this allowed her to live a fairly independent life. And she had a position working at the Imperial Library. So she was basically, overseeing the collection of texts. But these womanly virtues are kind of like the opposite of girl power, if you will. They are all emphasizing how women should defer to men. So womanly virtue in particular is described by Bon Chao as she does not distinguish herself in talent and intelligence. Now this is somewhat ironic, of course, because Bon Chao herself did just that. But I think the idea she had was that there's a kind of natural hierarchy between men and women in the Confucian idea. And so the woman, a sign of their virtue is they do not kind of stand out, even if they have this talent and intelligence. Womanly speech is she does not sharpen her language and speech. Womanly manner, she does not seek to be outwardly beautiful or ornamented. Womanly merit, she does not outperform others in her skills and cleverness. So there's this idea in Confucianism of women deferring to men, not standing out. And yet, Bon Chao was highly regarded at court. As soon as she wrote this text, which was mainly intended for her own family, it became widely copied and studied among others, and it's still a kind of like important Confucian text today. So also during the Han Dynasty, Daoism became quite important. It did not receive as much support from the emperors as did Confucianism. But there developed an interesting split between what you could call Dao Jia, philosophical Daoism, and Dao Jiao, religious Daoism. Dao Jia literally means the school of or the house of the Tao, whereas Dao Jiao means the tradition of the Tao. And Jiao is often used to refer to religions. Jia is often used to refer to schools of thought. So the philosophical Taoism is based on early texts from the Zhou dynasty, like the Warring States period especially, such as the Tao Te Ching and the Chuang Tzu. It's focusing mainly on a kind of mystical cosmology of the Tao. The Tao is this unmanifest, hidden force, the source of everything, gives rise to yin, yang, and the rest of the world that we see. It's also focusing on self-cultivation techniques for health and longevity. So the main focus of philosophical Taoism is not on worshiping gods or performing ceremonies. And that's different from religious Taoism. This grew out of Huanglao Jia and Dao Jia, philosophical Taoism, but it had other influences as well. So Fangxian Dao, the way of methods of immortality, and Chinese folk religion, which goes back to the origins of Chinese culture and civilization. In religious Taoism, the Tao Te Ching and Chuang Tzu are important, but they're treated as religious scriptures that were essentially revealed by semi-divine sages. Lao Tzu and other Taoist sages are worshipped as gods or godlike beings. The picture on the right shows Lao Tzu depicted as a celestial or heavenly god, kind of ruling from this jade throne from heaven. And indeed, some religious Taoists would regard Lao Tzu as a kind of human embodiment of this heavenly god who rules the entire universe. Now, this is not to say there's an absolute or sharp boundary or dichotomy between philosophical and religious Taoism. There was mutual influence between them throughout their history. However, there were many scholars more interested in philosophical Taoism, like the Tao Te Ching, Zhuangzi, self-cultivation, whereas religious Taoism can be distinguished by the focus on worshiping gods and spirits, performing ceremonies, having magical talismans, things like that. And also, religious Taoism, while it blends into this kind of not organized folk religion, it does have specific sects as well with their own doctrines and sacred scriptures. And all of that can be distinguished meaningfully from philosophical Taoism per se. So during the Han Dynasty, philosophical Taoism did continue to be important. One of the important texts of this tradition was the Huainan Si, which means the masters of Huainan, which is one of the ancient states of China. So this was actually a text sponsored by King Liu An of Huainan, and he presented it to his nephew, Emperor Wu of Han, in the hope of influencing Emperor Wu to becoming a supporter of his Taoist tradition. Instead, Emperor Wu did end up supporting Confucianism under the influence of Dong Zhongshu. But this became an important text nonetheless. It has a series of essays with advice to rulers on self-cultivation. So there's both a metaphysical self-cultivation aspect to this, but also a political dimension. It gives very specific advice to rulers based on Wu Xing or 5 elements theory, such as what color to wear based on the season of the year. And it has an elaboration of that whole system of correspondences that we touched on earlier. Another example of philosophical Taoism from the Han Dynasty is a text called The Records of the Grand Historian. This was authored by Sima Tan, the Grand Historian. So this was a scholar who wrote an official history for the Han Dynasty. But this history covered all of China, going back essentially to the origin of the world. So Sima Tan was the one who distinguished between the 6 schools of thought, or the 6 schools of Chinese philosophy: Rujia, Daojia, Fajia, Mojia, Mingjia, and Yin-Yang Jia. So Rujia is Confucianism, Daojia is philosophical Taoism, Fajia is the school of the law or legalism, Mojia was the school of Mo or Moism, Mingjia is the school of names, such as the philosophy of Huizi, and Yin-Yang Jia is the naturalists, or the school based on yin-yang theory and the 5 elements. And so Sima Tan was the first one basically to create this systematic organization of schools of philosophy that really went back to the earlier Warring States period. He himself was a follower of Huang Lao or Daoism, and his work was continued by his son, Sima Qian. So one example of the Taoist influence is this text does contain stories, for example, dialogues between Lao Tzu and Confucius. These are probably legendary, but oftentimes Lao Tzu is portrayed as kind of like an older and wiser contemporary of Confucius, who often takes this broader or more profound perspective. And that bias that tends to show up in the stories is probably reflective of Sima Tan's allegiance to Huang Lao or Taoism. Another really important influence on religious Taoism, besides philosophical Taoism itself, was this tradition called Feng Xian Dao. This means the way of methods, Feng, and immortality, Xian. Practitioners of Feng Xian Dao were known as Feng Shi, or masters of the methods. So what were the methods? Well, they did include methods to attain immortality, as the name suggests, but they also include things like systems of divination based on astrology and the Book of Changes, Yi Jing. The methods for immortality included alchemy, the creation of potions involving mercury and other substances that, if you ingested, would give you longevity and eventually immortality. We'll return to alchemy later. Other beliefs of the Fengxian Dao practitioners were that they could communicate with gods and spirits. So it was combining elements of shamanism with these metaphysical and cosmological doctrines. They would perform exorcisms to cure disease. They would also use herbal medicine and massage to heal. So this is like another origin of traditional Chinese medicine. They use spells and talismans, or fulu, to provide protection and healing. So on the right is a picture of an ancient talisman with magical writing. There is a belief in a kind of heavenly or spiritual writing that was used by the gods and spirits, and that was also studied by the Feng Shi and used in both talismans could be written on paper. Also, you can see there was a tradition of making these little coins or medallions, and these were believed to basically have a kind of spiritual power. They could heal you or protect you from harmful spirits. This tradition still continues in both religious Taoism and Chinese folk religion to this day. So there's also an aspect of religious Taoism, and overlaps with philosophical Taoism, of practices that are supposed to give you health, longevity, and ultimately immortality. And these three things can be viewed as three stages along a continuum. So the same practices that give you health now can prolong your life, and if perfected, even make you immortal. So this is a wide variety of practices. There were dietary practices such as bigu, which is not eating grains. So you would eat, for example, greens or herbs instead of rice or barley or other grains. There were other practices such as gymnastics or calisthenics, massage, and breathing techniques. You can see an ancient version of this on the picture on the right from a silk manuscript that was taken from a tomb in Mawang Dui. And the tomb was sealed in 168 BCE, so we know the manuscript is older than that. And that's the earliest known depiction of these sort of calisthenic exercises where you're moving your body. And this was believed to basically enhance or develop the flow of qi. It's the ancestor of the modern Tai Chi or Tai Chi Chuan, which is kind of like an exercise system, or it can also be a martial art. But when slowed down, it's a kind of gymnastic exercise that's believed to give you health. This Taoist tradition of health and longevity also includes the basis for acupuncture. So the acupuncture, where you place needles on channels or meridians where qi is believed to flow through the body, it's believed to alter the flow of qi, and so it can basically heal the body by changing the flow of energy. There also are Taoist sexual practices. So the famous one is reverting the semen to nourish the brain. Now, this is kind of similar in broad outline to the tantric practices originating in India, though as far as I know, they were developed separately. They're different in the details, and they're based on a different theory. But the overall idea is similar. So like in tantric sects, orgasm is believed to deplete your vital energy, or Jing. So in China, there's the notion of the three treasures, Jing, Qi, Shen. Jing is the most physical or base form of vital energy, and it's present in the semen. So if you ejaculate during orgasm, you lose some of your Jing or vital energy. So instead, there are visualization, meditation, and other techniques to cause you to not orgasm, but instead the semen is believed to stay inside the body and to reverse its flow up through the spine to the brain, where it's transformed or transmuted into Shen, more spiritual energy. And so doing these types of practices are believed to transform your chi into this more refined or spiritual form. And then when it's completely Shen or spirit, then you can become a Xian or immortal being. And there's kind of a fuzzy line between humans who become Xian or immortals and gods. They become essentially godlike beings. And also they kind of, the physical body is believed to dissolve. You can become a being of pure spirit. So this brings us to Daoist alchemy, or Dan. The word Dan literally means cinnabar, which is a compound containing mercury, which is believed to give you immortality if you combine it with some other minerals and herbs in a special potion or elixir. So this was originally a separate tradition. I mean, it got combined though with Daoism, with a text called The Seal of the Unity of the Three by Wei Bo-yang. He was a Daoist. So Wei Bo-yang regarded alchemy, or Dan, as one of three essentially unified traditions. There's Yin-Yang theory, ultimately deriving from the I Ching. Wu Wei, this is representing essentially philosophical Daoism, and then Dan, or alchemy. And so he thought these were all three different manifestations of the same principle, basically. So one way of looking at it is, if you understand the metaphysics of yin-yang, you can act according to Wu Wei, and you can also, through alchemy, give yourself health and ultimately immortality. So there's two different types, though, or approaches to alchemy: Wai Dan, or outer alchemy, and Nei Dan, or inner alchemy. The Wai Dan is the one where you create the literal physical potion using cinnabar and other materials. Inner alchemy, or Nei Dan, is an inner spiritual practice involving meditation, where you can train your mind and your breath and ultimately attain unity with the Tao. And it's a kind of moving from the outer world of form to the inner world. You go from the three treasures, from the outer Jing to the inner Shen, and ultimately your Shen or spirit can unite with the kind of primordial source of things. There's also an understanding of a spirit embryo. This is an immortal true self that is lying there within in embryonic or undeveloped form. And the idea that some people in Daoism have is that when you become an immortal, you're basically nourishing this inner spiritual self until it develops into a complete body and replaces your more crude physical body. So there's also a doctrine that is common in religious Taoism and just Chinese folk religion generally, of two different souls or spirits that people have: Hun and Po. So these correspond to Yang and Yin. Hun is the more spiritual soul associated with heaven and Yang energy. Po is the more material soul associated with earth and Yin energy. So according to the metaphysics here, Hun and Po join together in utero, in the embryo. So before you're born, they join together, and they are together your whole life. They only separate after your death. So after the death of your body, the Hun returns to its element, you could say, in heaven. And this is connected to the Shen. This is the spirit that is worshipped as an ancestor by your family, by your descendants or other family members. And the Po instead returns to the earth, literally as the decaying body, but also if a ghost or Gwei manifests, this would be associated with the Po. And then there's also a doctrine that eventually, after enough time has passed, they eventually merge back into their original element, so Yang or Yin, and kind of lose some of their individual identity. So there's a sense in which that individual identity is ultimately destroyed for most people, with the rare exceptions, right, of those who become a Xian or immortal. This differentiation between Hun and Po is also connected to different religious practices. So the goods that are buried in a grave and offerings left at the grave can be connected to the Po spirit, whereas offerings that are left to an ancestral tablet, a spirit tablet, like the ones you can see on the right, so you're not giving that offering, you're not performing that ritual graveside, that would be associated with the Hun spirit. It has this kind of cosmic or heavenly existence. And there is a custom in Chinese ancestor worship of giving food, drink, incense, or other offerings to an ancestor spirit, much like you might give those to a god. So Chinese folk religion, it's kind of like a concept developed by modern scholars. It's often labeled as Taoist, but in fact it predates Taoism, originates in the Shang Dynasty or even earlier, and it extends more widely than Taoism. So you can see temples like the Xuanyuan temple shown in the picture on the right in Shanxi, China. This is dedicated to the Yellow Emperor, who's this ancient legendary sage king. And so this is not a specifically or an exclusively Taoist practice per se. So you could kind of associate it with this concept of Chinese folk religion. It kind of pervades the culture. It's not like people would identify usually as, oh, I'm a member of this religion. It's just there as a kind of custom. So some examples of practices of Chinese folk religion are ancestor veneration, leaving offerings to ancestors and other gods or spirits, divination, exorcism, spirit mediumship, which is where a wu or spirit medium communicates to a god or spirit and possibly is even possessed by them temporarily, so the spirit speaks through them. All of these customs go back to the beginnings of Chinese religion, but they do continue to this day. An example of a text that emerges out of this folk tradition is the Chu Tzi, the Songs of the State of Chu. So Chu was a state in the south of ancient China. This book includes myths of the creation, accounts of different mythological creatures such as different types of dragons. There are also visions that people have of heavenly worlds and communion between humans and gods. So you can see the latter themes especially developed in religious Taoism, where the founders of different Taoist sects often have a vision of a heavenly being, and sometimes some teachings or doctrines are given to them by the gods, perhaps in a written form. So these sort of like messages come from heaven in spirit writing. That's kind of like an idea from both folk religion and religious Taoism. So let's talk a bit more about the gods and spirits, both of Chinese folk religion and religious Taoism. So the spirits are often divided into two main categories, heavenly and earthly. Heavenly spirits are often associated with actual celestial phenomena, such as stars, planets, or constellations. The earthly spirits are associated with physical features on the earth, like mountains, hills, rivers, lakes, seas, and the weather. And one interesting thing about the earthly spirits is that those associated with water, such as the spirits who govern rivers, lakes, or seas, are often regarded as dragons. So another important concept is the hierarchy of spirits, where you have this supreme heavenly god, often called the Jade Emperor, sometimes just called Tian or Heaven, sometimes called Dai Yi or the Supreme Unity, is the ruler of both all the spirits in heaven, but also all the other spirits. They're kind of like the emperor of the universe. But there's other sub-hierarchies as well. So for example, there are 5 sacred mountains in China. These are the most important mountains. Each one is governed by a god. And those gods are regarded as outranking or having precedence over gods of lesser peaks and hills. Another example is the Dragon King of the Eastern Sea. So the Eastern Sea, The Eastern Ocean is, the largest body of water from the perspective of ancient China. So the god of that body of water outranks those of all the lakes and rivers. So another example of gods besides Dai Yi or the Jade Emperor are the Wu Di, 5 emperors, also called the 5 lords. These are gods of the 5 elements, so this connects it to Wu Xing theory. And the picture on the right is an example of an altar to the Wu Di, a modern altar in a temple. Another example of a god is Tu Di Gong. This is the god of the earth. Now, he can be worshipped as a god of the earth in general. There's also like local versions of Tu Di Gong who are associated with particular territories, and they have kind of authority over that territory. So you could make an offering to Tu Di Gong to get their protection if you live in that area. Another example of this type of localized god is the city or town god who protects or rules a particular city. And there's also ancestor spirits, and some of these are only worshipped in particular families, but there's also a tradition of having ancient people who are worshipped as kind of like collective or national ancestors. And so this is when people who are believed to have been human become kind of elevated to this status of gods. So Confucius over time eventually became like this, where he's worshipped similar to how a god would be worshipped in a lot of traditional Chinese temples. Lao Tzu the same, but there were others as well, like famous generals who became war gods, etc. So another example of a god in Chinese religion is the Queen Mother of the West, Shi Wang Mu. This was a goddess who dates back to ancient times, but became very popular during a drought at the end of the Western Han Dynasty when a lot of people faced famine. So people prayed to her for blessings and protection. She's believed to live in a Western paradise called Kunlun that connects the heaven and the earth and is a place where immortals dwell. There was also an Eastern paradise that was an island. This Western paradise is on a tall mountain. So this is an example of some of the imagery or iconography associated with Shi Wang Mu. She is holding often peaches of immortality. So the belief is the peaches that grow in the Western paradise confer immortality if you eat them. She's often shown with 3 blue birds that are bringing her fruits. They're kind of like her little servants and messengers. She's often shown riding a phoenix, this large enchanted bird that can fly through the heavens. She's also associated with tigers because tiger is the animal of the West in the system of correspondences, and she is a goddess associated with the West. So it seems likely that Shi Wang Mu had an influence on later forms of Chinese Buddhism. So the way she's depicted is similar to the way the Bodhisattva Guan Yin is depicted in Chinese Buddhism. And there's something called the Pure Land in Chinese Buddhism, which is believed to be a paradise created by a Buddha that if you pray to Amitabha, you can be reborn there. That's similar in concept to the Western paradise of Shi Wang Mu. So let's discuss now some of the particular versions of religious Taoism that were formed during the Han Dynasty. Tianqi Dao means way of the heavenly or celestial masters. This was founded by Chang Daoling when he received a revelation from Lao Tzu. So this is that theme of a kind of vision of a god or spirit or ancestor that gives you special teachings. He founded Tianqi Dao in 142 CE. So one unique aspect of his sect is that it rejected animal sacrifice. Now this was a part, and still is, of traditional Chinese religion, where, for example, one ritual that's very common is to sacrifice a pig as a kind of offering to a god, and then to share that among an entire village or community. But that was rejected by Chang Daoling. He also created a doctrine of a heavenly or celestial bureaucracy. So this is kind of similar to the earlier idea of Mo Tzu, but there are all these different bureaus or offices of gods, and you go to a specific bureau based on what you want to pray for. So if you need a blessing related to education, that would be a different blessing than one related to, family or childbirth. So another practice that became prominent in this sect was the use of talismans, and these would have oftentimes written contracts on them, where the priest would create a contract between the human being and a god, and each one would have certain duties. So it's kind of like on the analog of a human business or legal contract. This is a practice still done in modern Taoist temples to this day. The followers of Tianqi Dao created a theocracy, or government by priest, in a southern state of Shu in China. And this basically was a precedent for religious organizations kind of meddling in politics. And that's part of the reason historically why religion is sometimes a sensitive topic politically in China today, especially in the PRC, the People's Republic of China. I mean, part of that is because of the communist ideology of the rulers, but also there is a history in China of conflict between religions and the secular authorities. Chengyi Dao means orthodox unity, the way of orthodox unity. And this is a way of referring to the teachings or doctrines of Chong Daoling. Even though Tianqi Dao, his sect, no longer survives, there are modern sects of Daoism that trace their origins to this set of teachings, Chengyi Dao. So that does still survive. You can see the image of Chong Daoling on the right. He's riding a tiger. That's often used in Daoism as a symbol both of mastery over nature, but also because the tiger was associated with the West and immortality. So another important Daoist sect of the Han Dynasty was Daiping Dao, or the Way of Great Peace. This was founded by the three Chang brothers in Shandong province, and it's based on a text called the Daiping Jing, the classic of great peace. This text taught that there was going to be a cosmic transition in which a new era of peace or harmony would be established. They took yellow as their color because of their interpretation of the Wuxing theory. So earth is associated with yellow. Earth is the element that overcomes water. Water was an element associated with the period or age of the Han Dynasty. And they thought, based on Wuxing theory, there was going to be a shift, a cosmic shift that happens in which the water element is replaced by the earth element as being dominant. Just as this cycle happens within 1 year with the change of seasons, there is a belief in a change of eras or ages. And so they wore the yellow because they thought they were embodiments of this new era that was about to dawn. And they were also called the yellow turbans or the yellow kerchiefs because they specifically would wear often a yellow headdress. They rebelled against the Han Dynasty in 184 CE, once again, by the way, showing the connection in Chinese history between religious groups, some religious groups, and politics or civil war. This rebellion, however, was crushed by the Han, and the Taiping Dao ended as a separate sect. Finally, during the Han Dynasty, we saw the introduction of Buddhism into China. It traveled to China through merchants and missionaries moving along the Silk Road through Central Asia into Western China. And when it first came there, it was interpreted as, by many, as a foreign form of Daoism. There were some superficial similarities. The practice of meditation, for example, the notion of emptiness, which had a different meaning in Daoism than the shunyata of Buddhism, but the similarity of the concepts, at least superficially, caused many to look at Buddhism as just a foreign version of Daoism. So there was even a doctrine that developed, especially among some Daoists, called Huahu, which means transforming the barbarians. According to this teaching, Lao Tzu, when he left China to the West, as tradition said, he actually didn't die or transcend the world, not immediately. He actually traveled to India, where he became known as the Buddha and taught Buddhism there. And the notion was that the differences in Buddhism and Taoism could be explained away as Lao Tzu having to kind of dumb things down for the barbarians. So over time, the particular doctrines of Buddhism became somewhat better understood in China. And there was a long period in which people puzzled over the doctrines and sort of ended up interpreting them in a way that made more sense, perhaps, from the Chinese perspective. One example of this doctrine that may have been puzzling at first was karma, especially as it was linked to rebirth or reincarnation, because this was different from the Daoist or other traditional theories of what happens after death. There was no belief in reincarnation in ancient Daoism. Eventually, many or most Daoists came to believe in rebirth under Buddhist influence. There was also a puzzle of the connection between the Buddhist doctrine of rebirth on the one hand and the not-self teaching on the other, because not-self sounds a lot like you don't have a self or a soul. So if you don't have a self or a soul, what gets reborn? Of course, in Buddhism, this is explained through the doctrine of karma and dependent origination. So even if there's no eternal self per se, there is a process of transformation in which your karma is inherited by a future being. You could say your future self or future selves. So once Buddhism came to spread in China, there were some criticisms of it. One example of that can actually be found in the Taoist scripture Dai Bing Jing. So you can see this Taoist critique of Buddhism actually seems similar to what a Confucian might say. And there was oftentimes a tendency to combine in practice Confucian and Taoist beliefs. So Buddhist monks were criticized for leaving home and abandoning their parents. They're not performing the Confucian virtue of Shao because they have to join their fellow monks in the monastery. They can't live at home and support their parents. Also, if they had been married and had children, they would have to abandon that life in order to become a monk. The celibacy of a monk also prevents them from continuing their family line. And finally, there is a notion that because monks are supposed to live off of gifts given to them by lay people, this promotes begging instead of productive contribution to society. And these criticisms of Buddhism would continue essentially up until modern times by Confucians and Taoists, but they would also be responded to by Buddhists, and in the end, Buddhism ended up spreading, becoming quite influential, especially after the Han Dynasty.